All right, so Joe Rogan finally decided to address the guest that he had on his podcast who went on to get arrested for murdering and dismembering somebody. If you're not familiar with the story, there's this civil rights attorney that Joe has on a lot, Josh Dubin, who usually brings on people who were wrongfully committed, and it's gone well, but recently he decided to push his luck with this last podcast, and he brought on this criminal, Sheldon Johnson, who they obviously presented as a reformed criminal, who they admit did commit crimes and was charged for them, but they claim he got an unfair sentence and he was screwed by the justice system, and now he's changed. He realized what he did was wrong, and he's turning his life around. But that podcast probably couldn't have aged much worse than it did, because only a month after that, and I think only a year since he had been out of jail, he went on to get charged with murder. And this happened about a month ago, so I figured at this point Joe probably wasn't going to address it at all. You know, I figured he would just let it die down, but then the other day when he had Akash on, he actually did bring it up, which probably wasn't the best idea because his response wasn't great. Like, he's still trying to downplay it and argue that maybe the criminal justice system is the problem and him being in jail is what caused him to go on to dismember somebody. So obviously most of the comments are criticizing Joe's response. You know, people are like, bro, they're downplaying his prior convictions and actions so much. Don't give this dude any credit. And another person said, Joe still got that woke far left mindset. And another person said, this is why we don't trust Rogan about other shit, because he can't be honest about this. So this gets brought up because they're talking about how flawed the justice system is. So Joe starts to refer to some of his Josh Dubin podcasts.
But you know what they do? They lock up black men for almost nothing and then force them to be slaves in prison.
Yeah.
And they create things. They work on the fucking chain gang.
Yeah.
All that shit is slavery.
Yeah.
It's just, and they would find ways to prosecute. Look, we
Illegal
know
marijuana.
today. I've done a ton of podcasts with Josh Dubin, who used to work with the Innocence Project, and now he's got his own thing with the Ike Perlmutter Center. But they find people that are wrongfully convicted and help them get out. We've had a bunch of those guys come on the podcast, including one guy who came on who was actually guilty. He was guilty before, and we knew he was guilty, but he got 50 years.
Right.
And then he was talking about he turned his life around, and his, like, a month after he was on the podcast?
Yeah.
How long was it after he was on the podcast?
Yeah.
2 months? Maybe 2 months? Cut some dude's head off.
Yeah.
And he was wearing a blonde wig, and homie didn't understand new HD security cameras. Like, this dude put a blonde wig on. They got crystal clear footage of him with his goatee on, wearing a blonde wig, carrying some dude's head.
And I'm surprised Joe would even bring up Josh Dubin, because it seemed like Joe didn't really want to address the situation. But once you bring him up, then obviously you have to talk about the elephant in the room. And I figured Joe was probably just done with him after the whole situation, you know, because I can't imagine Joe was too happy with him for bringing this guy on. Like, almost every article that was written about this story mentioned Joe in the headline. So obviously it was a bad look for Joe, but it is fascinating to go back and listen to that podcast, knowing what happened afterwards. And obviously hindsight is 20/20, but looking back on it, you could definitely tell the signs were there that this guy hadn't changed much. And even right when that podcast was first released, there were a lot of people that were very skeptical of him. But I guess Joe must have just put all his trust in Josh, that he brings on guests that won't dismember somebody a month later. Like, I also saw this comment that I thought was pretty funny. They said, I wonder how many hours Dubin spends to get a person like Sheldon released. Imagine spending hundreds or thousands of hours, and the accumulation of your work is that a man gets his head cut off. Yeah, and all that time and effort put into this guy just to have him completely destroy your credibility. And it's just wild that Sheldon managed to bullshit his way onto the biggest podcast in the world only a year after he had gotten out of prison. I mean, he did have a good opportunity to turn things around and be a positive influence, but he just didn't care. So also, while Joe's talking about this, Akash actually asks a really good question, which of course Joe doesn't answer, and he tries to skirt around it. But Akash asks him how convincing Sheldon was, like if Joe actually believed that he was reformed. And then Joe just starts downplaying all his crimes again. And then he tries to say maybe the reason he ended up killing somebody is because of the time he spent in prison. Like, that's the problem here.
How sold were you in the room with him? How good was he at selling himself as this reformed person?
Well, you know, what does it mean? Okay, so he didn't kill anybody in jail. And then he's out now, and he's got this new lease on life, and he's out, and he, you know, he's trying to do something different with his life. When you listen to his explanation of what happened, why he went to jail, so he was a drug dealer.
Right.
And he had gone to jail before, and some dude owed him money. Some dude, some drug deal, and the guy was like, "Fuck you." So he found the guy and he pistol whipped him and he robbed him.
Okay.
And he got 50 years for that.
Right.
And he was a habitual criminal for sure. So, should he have gotten 50 years for that? Well, I don't know. I mean, it seems like when he got out, he was kind of a bad guy.
Yeah.
But was that because he spent 25 fucking years in jail? Because he was 20. I think he did 25 years before they let 24 before they let him out, which is an insane amount of time to be locked up in a prison and then expect to acclimate. And
so you're saying, did prison make him much worse?
Did prison make him much worse? Because it certainly can with some people.
Yeah.
But we've had people on that were innocent, and prison made them amazing. I mean, something about like the constant studying and the accepting your situation in life, even though you were innocent. And then a lot of those guys got released, and it's crazy to see them like they lost 20 years of their life for something that was bullshit, complete bullshit. And then you find out that the cops and the prosecutors who were involved in their case had done that to many, many, many people. That's another thing that people need to take into consideration. How dirty some people involved in prosecuting and convicting people are.
Yeah.
It's funny that Joe tries to argue that maybe prison made him much worse, but then right after that, he brings up examples of people who were wrongfully committed and got out of prison and were amazing people. So if somebody like that can get out and be positive about it and not commit any crimes and just live a happy life, then there's no excuse for what Sheldon did. Like, there's another guest that Josh Dubin brought on Joe's podcast, Bruce Bryan, who was wrongfully committed and spent 30 years in prison. And in the beginning of the podcast, Joe starts talking about how amazed he is that this guy could be in such a good mood and be so positive about the whole situation. So if somebody like this can spend 30 years in prison for something they didn't even do and get out and be a great guy and just enjoy life, then Joe using the excuse that maybe jail is what caused Sheldon to go on to murder that guy just sounds absolutely ridiculous.
Like, guys started realizing while you were there, your story. Like, the word started getting around the green room, and it was one of those things where, like, what? He just got out 3 weeks ago, wrongfully accused for 30 years, and here he is having a good time. It was a crazy experience to like be sharing the green room with you, because you could see everybody. Like, you became like the celebrity of the green room. You know what I'm saying? Like, everybody wanted to hear the story. Everybody wanted to talk to you. Everybody was blown away by it and by the grace that you displayed. Like, the fact that you could be wrongfully accused, spend 30 years of your young life in a cage, and then come out and just be this wonderful, fun guy, having a good time. Everyone's laughing, having conversations. It was beautiful.
Yeah, and the comments for this episode were all really positive, other than people complaining about Josh Dubin talking too much. But people are like, damn, Bruce seems like a really genuine guy. I hope he heals and continues to make a difference. I wish we heard more of him. Somebody else said, this is one of the best episodes in a while, definitely worth listening to. Somebody said, yeah, the best one I can remember. Bruce is really damn articulate and seems like a good person, even after all the BS he endured. So if you compare this to the Sheldon Johnson episode, there's a huge difference. You know, like I said, immediately with the Sheldon one, people realize, like, yeah, this guy is just a criminal. You know, he doesn't sound over it. Doesn't sound like he changed. I think he's just a bad dude. But for some reason, even after everything that's happened, Joe is kind of struggling to admit that, and he wants to try to blame it on the justice system. So that's about it for this video. If you guys want more content from me, make sure you go check out my Patreon account. I post a new video every week that's usually around 30 minutes long, and I think there are over 70 videos on there. You can hear about some of the cringiest or most awkward Joe Rogan Experience episodes and a ton of other stuff. If you enjoy the channel, I highly recommend it. There'll be a link in the description.